Well, nobody was tougher in Russia than me. That has to do with the pipeline, as you know, Nord Stream 2 and lots of other things. But I'm not happy. I'm not happy. I'm not happy about the whole situation. You know, it's interesting. It doesn't affect us because it's not our soldiers. But they're losing now. I used to tell you 5,000. They're losing 7,000 between Ukraine and Russia, 7,000 soldiers every single week. It's such a horrible waste of humanity. So, no, I am not thrilled with what's happening there, I will tell you. I think it's going to get settled. So I settled 7 wars. This, I would have said, would have been maybe the easiest one to settle of all. But with war, you never know what you're getting. But we're going to get it. I believe we're going to get it settled. But I am not happy with them. I'm not happy with anything having to do with that war. It's just such a waste of great humanity.
The US is ready to cause a total collapse of the Russian economy, the second phase of sanctions against Russia to be imposed by President Trump. Meanwhile, Trump has renamed the Department of Defense as the Department of War. Could new sanctions against Russia force Putin to halt his war, and what does Trump's move on DoD mean? US President Donald Trump has indicated his readiness to implement a new phase of sanctions against Russia. This move marks a potential shift in US policy as frustration grows over the prolonged war in Ukraine and stalled diplomatic efforts. Trump has publicly confirmed that his willingness to impose what he describes as a second phase of sanctions on Russia, although details about measures have not yet been disclosed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has elaborated on the potential scope of these sanctions, suggesting that they may target nations such as China and India, which continue to import Russian oil despite international efforts to stop the war. According to Bessent, the goal is to exert economic pressure on Russia by disrupting its oil revenue streams, by increasing the incentives for Russian dictator Putin to return to the negotiating table. In addition to these developments, President Trump announced plans for European leaders to visit the US within the week to discuss the next steps over Ukraine. These diplomatic initiatives coincide with the recent summit held in Paris, where leaders from 26 countries committed to providing Ukraine with security guarantees. French President Emmanuel Macron emphasized that these guarantees would involve the deployment of international forces across land, sea and air to deter Russia's aggression. The summit also underscored coordinated efforts to maintain sanctions not only on Russia but also on China, reflecting growing concerns about China's role in this war. As the situation continues to evolve, international leaders closely monitoring how these diplomatic efforts and sanctions will influence the trajectory of the war and the geopolitical landscape. Meanwhile, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently stated that new sanctions against Russia could lead to economic collapse of the Russian economy. Bessent explains that the economic collapse of Russia might be a critical factor in compelling Kremlin to reconsider its current position. He suggests that this financial downfall could shift Putin's calculus, pushing him toward diplomatic engagement, according to Reuters. Describing the situation, Bessent said that the conflict is a race between two opposing forces: the durability of Ukraine's efforts versus the longevity of Russia's economy under pressure. He indicated that within a proper coordination of sanctions, especially targeting countries continuing to purchase Russian oil, Western nations could potentially drive the Russian economy into a full-scale collapse. This, he believed, would in turn force Putin to a position where negotiations become a strategic necessity. The Treasury Secretary also emphasized that any effort to bring about a Russian economic collapse would need strong coordination with European allies. Bessent made it clear that the US was prepared to increase pressure throughout sanctions and secondary tariffs. The effort would only be fully effective if implemented jointly with the European Union. Bessent is expected to meet soon with EU officials in Washington to discuss further coordinated actions against Moscow. Bessent reportedly argued that a secondary phase of economic measures should include tariffs not only on Russia but also on countries that purchase Russian oil, singling that for examples like India, which continues to import discounted Russian crude oil. The strategy, he noted, was not merely punitive, but rather designed to dry up a core revenue stream funding Russia's war machine. Times of India and The Guardian confirmed US officials are exploring the possibility of widening the sanction net, possibly even threatening tariffs on nations that indirectly support Moscow's energy exports. The secretary's comments also appear to align with broader messaging from the White House, where President Trump has indicated his willingness to move forward with this so-called second phase of sanctions on Russia. According to Reuters' article published Sunday, the administration is actively reviving new economic tools that could apply pressure on Putin's government and restrict Russia's economic interactions globally. Moreover, a Reuters Ipsos poll also found that 62% of Americans support this approach, imposing penalties on countries that help fund Russia's war economy by purchasing its energy exports. Meanwhile, in an editorial published by The Washington Post on August 2nd, columnist Meghan McArdle makes a compelling case for crucial escalation in sanctions strategy to impose secondary sanctions on a third-party nations that continue to buy Russian oil. This approach is essential to applying maximum pressure on Russia and cutting off the lifeblood of its war machine. Russia's war economy depends heavily on oil revenues, which fund its military operations in Ukraine. Despite Western sanctions targeting Russian oil exports, countries such as India and China have stepped up in buying crude oil at discounted rates, significantly mitigating the intended economic impact. According to the editorial, India and China export approximately 85% of Russia's oil, with India alone purchasing nearly 34% and China around 47%. The ongoing purchases have allowed Russia to sustain war against Ukraine. McArdle points out that without targeting these buyers, sanctions will fall short of their goal. Quote, "Secondary sanctions on these countries are the next logical step. Without them, Moscow will continue to find buyers willing to undercut the impact of Western policies." Moreover, an editorial highlights a shift in tone and approach under the Trump administration right now. Unlike prior cautions, this administration is more willing to enforce tariffs and import taxes on countries that purchase Russian oil above set price caps, aiming to deter such transactions. This policy shift represents a strategic change, acknowledging that soft sanctions have not produced sufficient pressure to compel Russia to end this war. While the case for secondary sanctions is strong, the editorial acknowledges the significant risks involved. Sanctions economic giants like China or India could provoke diplomatic backlash and retaliation. The complexity of this global supply chain and economies means the sanctions could trigger only also unintended consequences. McArdle cautious that such measures might strain US-China relations, potentially escalating tensions. However, the potential for retaliation could involve tariffs or restriction on US companies operating in these countries, complicating the calculus of sanctions policy. Yet, the editorial argues that the stakes warrant such risks, given the strategic imperative to undercut Russia's war funding. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has renamed the Department of Defense as the Department of War. Here are the main reactions from various US media. The Washington Post criticizes this move and says that the remaining was largely symbolic and potentially counterproductive. Editorials express concerns that this move distracts from more substantive military needs, such as modernization readiness. They argue that rebranding without congressional approval raises constitutional questions and could undermine civilian oversight of the military. The Post also highlighted the financial cost of this, calling it unnecessary expenditure when defense budgets are already stretched. The New York Times also criticized the move as a political stunt, suggesting it reflects a nostalgic, overly militaristic mindset that fails to consider the complexities of modern defense. Their opinion pieces warns that glorifying wars throughout such symbolism risks normalizing conflict instead of promoting peace. They also raise concerns about confusion both domestically and internationally, as the Department of Defense is well known worldwide under its current name. CNN's analysis emphasized skepticism among defense experts and lawmakers who question the timing and practicality of this rebranding. They highlight voices warning that rebranding alone will not improve military effectiveness and may even distract from urgent issues like troop welfare and equipment modernization. Fox News, however, presents strong support for the renaming, portraying it as a much-needed reaffirmation of American military strength and readiness. Commentators praise the move as a cutting throughout the bureaucratic euphemism, sending a clear message that the US is prepared to defend itself and its interests. They argue that the name Department of War better reflects the realities the military faces by bolsters morale by embracing a warrior ethos. Breitbart frames the rebranding as a symbolic reclaiming of America's military heritage and rejection of political correctness that softens the brutal realities of war. Their commentary underscores that it's time to stop hiding behind vague terms and face the hard truth that defense involves warfighting. They applaud President Trump for taking a bold step that resonates with the many service members, while more measured, the Wall Street Journal editorial board supports the renaming as it reflects a renewed commitment to defense and acknowledges the reality of global threats. They caution against dismissing also symbolism altogether, noting that names and language matter in shaping military culture and public perception. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.